Imagine a moment when a teacher's attempt to humiliate a young student sparks a journey that transforms his entire life. This is the story of Trevor Hayes, a talented musician who entered Westlake High on a prestigious music scholarship, only to be met by disdain and cruelty from the very person who was meant to nurture his gift. Trevor had always believed that music was his safe haven, a language through which he could speak to the world without words. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was about to unfold. On his first day at Westlake, Trevor clutched the straps of his worn backpack as he walked along the gleaming corridors of the school. The polished floors stretched out like a pathway paved with opportunity, yet they also echoed with the unspoken judgment of students who moved with the easy confidence of privilege. Every reflective surface, every trophy case brimming with awards, reminded him of the divide between his humble beginnings and the world of high achievement that surrounded him. With a quiet determination, he repeated the encouraging words his father had whispered that morning, words meant to fortify his resolve against the harsh realities of a new and intimidating environment. As he made his way to the music department, a friendly face stepped forward from the crowd. Marcus Johnson, a tall boy with genuine eyes and a warm smile, greeted him by saying, "New kid, I'm Marcus Johnson. Need help finding your way around?" Grateful for the kindness, Trevor replied softly, "I'm Trevor Hayes. I'm looking for the music department." Marcus's smile widened when he mentioned Mrs. Winter's class, warning him in a gentle tone, "Follow me, but fair warning, Mrs. Winter is tough on everyone, especially those who are new." Even as Marcus spoke, Trevor could feel a pit of anxiety forming in his stomach, yet he trusted that Marcus's guidance would help him navigate this unfamiliar territory. When they reached the music room, the rich, resonant sound of a perfectly tuned piano floated through the air. Standing in the doorway, Trevor paused to take in the scene before him. The room was filled with an array of instruments, each one gleaming under the bright lights, a stark contrast to the limited and outdated equipment of his old school. It was a space where creativity was meant to thrive, yet a dark shadow lurked in the form of Mrs. Kathleen Winters, the music teacher whose reputation for harshness was well known. With silver-streaked blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun and eyes that scrutinized every movement, she stopped her playing the moment she noticed the newcomers. "Mr. Johnson, you're late," she said coolly, her tone laced with a cutting severity. And then she turned her gaze on Trevor, remarking in an accusing voice, "And you've brought a guest." Marcus quickly introduced Trevor, explaining that he was a transfer student here on a music scholarship. But Mrs. Winter's eyes narrowed even further as she assessed him, her critical stare making him feel exposed and diminished, as though he were nothing more than an experiment under her unyielding scrutiny. "Scholarship student," she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Interesting. What is your instrument?" Trevor answered in a small voice, "Guitar and piano, and I also play some percussion." At the mention of his versatility, she raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested she was already writing him off as an overreaching amateur. "At Westlake, we value technical precision in classical training. I hope your background has prepared you adequately," she said, emphasizing each word as if to stamp him with an unalterable mark of inadequacy. Trevor had heard these words before from other authority figures who had judged him without truly knowing him. Inside, his heart pounded like a drum as he silently recalled the years of lessons from his mother, a former session musician, and the online mentorship from a respected musician who had helped him secure his scholarship. When Mrs. Winters dismissed him with a curt, "Take a seat then, try to keep up," he sank into an empty chair, feeling as if he were already failing at the very moment he stepped through the door. Around him, curious whispers and furtive stares from fellow students stoked the flames of his insecurity. He opened his notebook and began to tap his fingers on the desk in a rhythmic plea for solace, clinging to the hope that music could somehow shield him from the bitter judgment of those who already saw him as an outsider. In the weeks that followed, Trevor struggled to adapt to a routine that was as lonely as it was challenging. Each day he endured Mrs. Winter's thinly veiled condescension and relentless criticism, while the high-pressure environment of Westlake weighed heavily on him. Late one evening, when the school corridors had quieted and only the faint hum of the building remained, Trevor sought refuge in an unused practice room. The custodian, a kindly older man with a knowing nod, unlocked the door to room B and gently warned him, "Don't stay too late, son. I've got rounds to finish." With a respectful, "Yes, sir," Trevor stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to a stunning acoustic guitar that hung on the wall. Unlike the student instruments that were well worn and battered, this guitar was a masterpiece, with intricate abalone inlays and a rich cedar top that glowed in the low light of the room. Unable to resist its allure, Trevor's fingers itched to caress the strings of the prized instrument. After carefully practicing his assigned classical pieces, he reached out and lifted the guitar from its mount, its weight feeling just right in his hands. He tuned it by ear, letting the notes flow in a composition that was entirely his own, a unique blend of blues, jazz, and classical influences that perfectly captured the essence of his soul. Lost in the music, he poured every ounce of his heart into the melody, only to be abruptly interrupted by a voice that cut through the notes like a razor. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Winters demanded, her tone as sharp as a knife. Trevor's fingers froze mid-strum, and he stuttered out a feeble, "I was just practicing, Mom. I didn't know." But she was relentless, her face flushing with anger. "Put it down immediately. Do you have any idea how much that guitar is worth?" she snapped, implying that his scholarship was nothing compared to the prized possession before him. With trembling hands, he carefully returned the guitar to its mount, his heart aching with both fear and sorrow. The words that followed only deepened his misery. "The way you were playing that instrument, it sounds like nothing more than noise. And who gave you permission to be in this room after hours?" Before he could muster a response, the custodian reappeared in the doorway, confirming Mrs. Winters' scathing remarks about his habitual practice sessions. Outside, in the dimly lit hallway where the only light came from flickering overhead fixtures, Trevor's hands shook uncontrollably. Every step he took felt laden with the weight of potential failure, as if one misstep would shatter the fragile hope he clung to. The custodian's quiet reassurance, "Don't you worry, son, just keep playing your music," did little to alleviate the torment that churned inside him. As he made his way home through the gathering darkness, his thoughts were consumed by the impending punishment. Tomorrow he would have to face Principal Edwards in what felt more like a courtroom than a school office, with Mrs. Winters playing both prosecutor and relentless judge. In the sterile, intimidating confines of Principal Edwards' office, the atmosphere was tense. The principal, a balding man with reading glasses that seemed to magnify the gravity of the situation, listened with a practiced neutrality as Mrs. Winters recounted every detail of the incident with a cold precision. "Unauthorized access to restricted areas," she declared. "Handling expensive equipment without permission. These are serious matters." Her voice carried a tone of finality, as though she had already decided that Trevor was unworthy of forgiveness. Yet even as the principal suggested that the offenses might not warrant expulsion for a first-time mistake, Mrs. Winters' words cut deep, framing the incident as an act of blatant disrespect and lack of discipline. When the principal directly asked Trevor for his account, he could barely find the courage to speak. "I was practicing, sir," he began softly, "and I had permission for Mr. Reynolds to use the room." His apology was sincere but timid, and Mrs. Winters' scoffing laughter in response only served to deepen his humiliation. It was during this painful moment of confrontation that Trevor's inner resolve stirred, a spark of defiance born from years of suppressing his true self. When she ridiculed his style of music, claiming that his own composition was nothing more than an over-ambitious experiment, he met her gaze with a quiet intensity. "I was playing my own composition," he declared, his voice trembling but determined. "It combines classical techniques with a contemporary blend that is uniquely mine." His words, though soft, carried the weight of a lifetime of practice and passion, challenging the teacher's narrow definition of talent. In that brief moment, it was as if the room held its breath, the air thick with the tension of a battle between old, rigid expectations and the fresh, unyielding spirit of a young musician determined to make his own mark. Yet, the challenge was set. Next week, Trevor was to perform for Mrs. Winters' entire class. It was a cruel trap that promised public humiliation if he faltered, a moment designed to confirm her low expectations rather than celebrate his hidden brilliance. As he left the office, Marcus greeted him in the hallway with a mix of sympathy and apprehension. "What happened?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide with concern. "You're not expelled, are you?" Trevor could only shake his head in despair. "Worse," he murmured. "I have to perform in front of her class next Friday." The weight of the impending performance pressed down on him like a heavy burden, as every note he had ever played now carried the risk of exposing his vulnerability. That very evening, over a modest dinner in their small apartment, Trevor's father listened intently to the unfolding events. With his work uniform still on and a look of both pride and worry etched on his face, he offered to speak to Principal Edwards on his behalf. But Trevor, determined to face this trial on his own, gently refused. In that quiet exchange between father and son, the legacy of his mother, a renowned session musician who had once graced the stages of Juilliard, echoed in his mind. Her words, urging him never to let anyone dictate what music he could create, served as a bittersweet reminder that even in the face of overwhelming cruelty, his passion would be his salvation. This first chapter of Trevor Hayes' journey is a testament to the power of music as both a refuge and a call to defiance. It is a story filled with the painful contrasts of harsh judgment and gentle encouragement, of a brilliant young talent forced to stand up against a relentless and cruel adversary. As you listen to this account, remember that every note played in the face of injustice is a declaration of hope, a hope that even the deepest wounds can heal with the transformative power of art and determination. Trevor's father squeezed his shoulder and said, "Show them who you are, son, not who they think you are." Later that evening, Trevor sat quietly on his bed holding his mother's old guitar. It wasn't nearly as fancy as the prized instrument Mrs. Winters guarded so jealously, but it was filled with history and love. With his phone propped up beside his lamp, he dialed in a video call that connected him to Elijah Carter, an acclaimed guitarist and composer whose warm presence had become a beacon in his life. On the screen, Elijah's kind eyes appeared and he asked, "Trevor, how's this new school treating you?" The tone in his voice was gentle yet probing. "I need your help, Mr. Carter," Trevor confessed, his voice low with determination and a hint of desperation. He explained that he had only one shot to change people's minds about him. He was beginning to understand that Mrs. Winters was setting him up to fail, using his love for music as a weapon to keep him down. But music had never let him down before, and he wasn't about to betray that trust now. That Friday arrived with an oppressive weight of expectation. When Trevor walked into the music room, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The soft murmur of conversation dwindled into a tense hush. Every student's eyes flickered between him and the steely gaze of Mrs. Winters, who stood at the front with an air of cruel anticipation. "Mr. Hayes," she called out in a tone that brooked no argument, "since you believe yourself qualified to handle valuable instruments without supervision, perhaps you would care to demonstrate your abilities for the class." She pointed at a basic acoustic guitar that, while not the finest in the collection, was hardly ordinary. A few snickers rippled through the room as the promise of public embarrassment loomed large. Trevor's heart pounded as he accepted the challenge. He took the guitar and meticulously checked its tuning, his fingers trembling ever so slightly under the watchful eye of Mrs. Winters, whose thinly veiled impatience was almost palpable. In the back row, Marcus offered him an encouraging thumbs up, and nearby Sofia Rodriguez discreetly set her phone on her desk, her eyes already recording every moment. Closing his eyes for a brief second to center himself, Trevor let his fingers begin to dance across the strings. He started with a rendition of Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, playing it with such technical precision that even the soft tapping of Mrs. Winters' pen came to a sudden halt. As he continued, he wove in elements of blues and jazz, transforming the classic melody into something both familiar and startlingly new. The entire room fell silent as the final note lingered in the air before erupting into spontaneous applause. Marcus cheered loudly, while others exchanged glances of surprised admiration. Yet, true to her cruel nature, Mrs. Winters wasted no time in dismissing the display. Clearing her throat in a tone that dripped with condescension, she remarked, "Well, that was technically adequate, though I do question the artistic liberty taken with a classic piece." A student in the back called out in genuine amazement, "That was amazing! But Mrs. Winters shot back, "Beginner's luck. Anyone can memorize one piece." Then, with a sneer that chilled him to the core, she fixed her steely eyes on him and announced, "Next week, Mr. Hayes, perhaps you would care to attempt something more challenging. I expect you to perform Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez, second movement." Although it was listed in the syllabus for the next semester, her words were laced with sarcasm as she implied that his so-called advanced abilities should make the assignment effortless. Trevor recognized the trap immediately. The piece was notorious for its difficulty and required a level of technical mastery that few high school students ever reached. After he returned the guitar to its stand, Sophia approached him quietly and said, "That was incredible." Her words were soft but sincere, yet she added gently, "Don't let her get to you." It was clear from her tone that she too had experienced Mrs. Winters' harsh expectations. "My older brother had her too," Sophia confided, "and I know how she sets her favorites and expects nothing less than perfection." Her words carried the bitter legacy of someone who had been unfairly judged, and they only deepened Trevor's sense of isolation and vulnerability. Later that afternoon, as he recounted Mrs. Winters' new assignment to Marcus, his friend whistled low and said, "Man, that's cold. She's really trying to set you up for failure." Trevor's voice hardened as he replied, "I'm not going to let her break me. I picked the wrong person to mess with if she thinks she can control me." Yet even as he spoke, a part of him trembled with the realization that every note he played was a battle against a system that saw him only as an outsider. As the days passed, whispers about his performance spread like wildfire through the school's social networks. Sophia had shared a video of his performance, and soon it wasn't just his classmates who were watching. Even parents began to comment, questioning the cruelty of Mrs. Winters and her relentless treatment of a student who was clearly talented. For an entire week, Trevor barely slept. Every spare minute was devoted to mastering Rodrigo's comp. His fingers became calloused and sore, and his shoulders ached from countless hours of practice. Late one night, as he continued to play in the dim glow of his room, his father appeared at his door and said, "You're pushing yourself too hard, son. She is not worth this pain." But Trevor shook his head and murmured, "It's not about her, Dad. It's about the music and proving that I can rise above every limitation they've placed on me." Both father and son knew deep down that it was about something more than just the notes on a page. It was about proving to the world that he was capable of greatness, despite every cruel remark and every dismissive sneer. At school, the transformation in his reputation was undeniable. Students who had once ignored him now nodded in the hallways, and his classmates whispered words of admiration that, although soft-spoken, felt like a balm to his wounded pride. But with every compliment came a sharper rebuke from Mrs. Winters. Her criticisms during class grew more biting, and her assignments increasingly impossible, each one designed to expose what she saw as his inherent weaknesses. Once, after a particularly grueling lesson, Marcus pulled him aside and asked, "Do you know why she's doing this?" Trevor could only shrug, too exhausted to find the words. Marcus continued, "My cousin goes to Westlake East. He says Mrs. Winters used to teach there until she had an incident with a student. Something about her refusing to recommend him for a scholarship because he didn't fit her idea of a suitable candidate." The revelation stung, not just because it confirmed what Trevor suspected, but because it deepened his sense of betrayal at being treated as less than he was. That evening, as Trevor sat alone with Rodrigo's score spread out before him, memories of his mother flooded back. Lila Hayes had been his first teacher. She had gently guided his small hands over piano keys when he was barely tall enough to reach them. She used to say that music was not just about hitting the right notes, but about finding your voice in every chord. After her passing 3 years ago, the pain of her absence had nearly driven him away from music entirely. But then, on a whim, he had submitted a video of himself playing one of her compositions to Elijah Carter's online masterclass. He had never expected a reply, and yet Elijah's words had been a revelation. "Your playing has something many technically proficient musicians lack," the message had read. "You have soul." Those words had rekindled his passion and renewed his commitment to his craft. Now, as Friday's second performance loomed closer, Trevor prepared not only his fingers but his heart, determined to channel every ounce of grief, hope, and defiance into his music. In the days that followed, Sophia continued to document Trevor's journey. Her videos not only captured his struggles and triumphs, but also sparked conversations far beyond the school walls. Comments poured in from students, teachers, and even concerned parents who questioned the harsh treatment Trevor was receiving. The growing support fed into his determination, even as Mrs. Winters escalated her cruelty. On the eve of his second performance, Trevor received another video call from Elijah Carter. Elijah's concerned voice came through the screen. "You look exhausted, Trevor. Remember what we talked about. Technique without feeling is just noise." Trevor replied, "I know the notes, but this piece, it demands something more." Elijah agreed softly. "Rodrigo wrote that piece after a personal tragedy. It's not just music, it's grief made audible." Then, pausing for a moment, he asked, "What does this piece make you feel, Trevor?" In that hushed moment, Trevor thought of his mother, of the endless nights spent in solitude, and of the struggle to be seen for who he truly was. "Everything," he whispered. Elijah's calm nod was a silent affirmation. "Then that is exactly what you play," he said. "Not for your teacher, not for your classmates, but for yourself." The day of the performance dawned grey and rainy, mirroring the heaviness in Trevor's heart. Doubt crept in as he prepared to face the room again, a room that now held not only the weight of Mrs. Winters' expectations, but also the hopes of everyone who believed in him. At breakfast that morning, his father noticed the haunted look in his eyes and said gently, "Your mother used to get that look before her performances. She called it the reckoning, the moment when you truly face your own expectations." Trevor pushed his plate of eggs around, voicing his fear. "What if I can't do it, Dad? What if I mess up and prove her right?" His father set down his coffee, his voice firm yet tender. "Son, that woman made up her mind about you the moment you walked into her classroom. Nothing you do or do not do will change that in her eyes. But remember, this is not about her. This is about honoring your gift, the one your mother saw in you before you even spoke a word." That encouragement, though bittersweet, steeled Trevor's resolve as he stepped into the music room once more. Inside the room, the air was thick with anticipation. Word of the challenge had spread, and several students from other classes had gathered to witness what many expected would be another public spectacle of failure. Mrs. Winters, looking perturbed by the extra audience, quickly regained her composure and announced, "Mr. Hayes, I believe you were to prepare Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez." With a sneer, she added, "Though I must admit, it might have been unfair to expect a student of your background to master such a sophisticated piece in just 1 week." Her words fell like a verdict, heavy and unyielding. Trevor took the basic guitar once again and seated himself on the stool at the front of the room. As he began to tune the instrument, he could feel his hands trembling. The room felt oppressively warm and the faces around him blurred as anxiety threatened to overpower him. In that moment of near despair, his eyes caught the glint of Sophia's phone, its camera lens fixed directly on him, capturing every fraught second of his struggle. Even as he felt the crushing weight of expectation, he steeled himself to play not for Mrs. Winters or the skeptical onlookers, but for the memory of his mother, for the music that had always been his true refuge, and for the promise that he would rise above the cruelty and injustice that had shadowed his every step. Trevor felt a slight nod of encouragement from Marcus, and somewhere beyond the classroom walls, he sensed the comforting presence of his late mother and his mentor, Elijah Carter, along with everyone who had believed in him when he doubted himself. Closing his eyes, Trevor placed his trembling fingers on the guitar strings. The first tentative notes of the adagio filled the room, gradually growing in confidence, as if speaking a heartfelt conversation between absence and presence, between what he had lost and what still remained. As the music flowed, something inside him began to break open. He was no longer performing for Mrs. Winters or trying to prove himself to anyone. He was simply expressing the truth he carried deep in his soul. Tears streamed silently down his cheeks, yet his fingers never wavered as the melody rose and fell, telling a story of sorrow and transcendence. When the final note faded, Trevor opened his eyes to discover a room transformed. Students sat in stunned silence, many wiping away tears of their own, and even Mrs. Winters appeared momentarily shaken as her usual stern composure cracked to reveal a hint of vulnerability. The spell was broken when Marcus stood and applauded with genuine, unrestrained enthusiasm. For the first time since his arrival at Westlake, Trevor felt truly seen, though it was not a triumph over his tormentor, but rather a recognition of his inner worth. The following week, an unusual tension gripped the music room. Whispers filled the air as students took their seats, glancing nervously at Mrs. Winters, who arranged sheet music with an unusual quiet. Trevor entered with Marcus by his side, and they were surprised to find the classroom packed not only with music students but with peers from all over the school. In the back, Principal Edwards observed with crossed arms and keen interest. "Sophia's videos went viral over the weekend," Marcus murmured, explaining that the second clip had already reached 50,000 views. Before long, Mrs. Winters called the class to order, her voice carrying its usual authority, yet now edged with an uncharacteristic wariness. She turned to Trevor and said, "Mr. Hayes, since you seem to have attracted quite an audience, perhaps you would care to demonstrate your interpretation of Paganini's Caprice No. 24. This piece, known as one of the most technically demanding on string instruments, was meant to humiliate him further." Trevor's heart sank as he realized he had not prepared for this so-called challenge, the Mount Everest of guitar adaptations. The condescending tone in Mrs. Winters' voice only fueled his determination. "I'll play it," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. As Sophia discreetly readied her phone, Trevor closed his eyes and recalled a masterclass from Elijah. In that moment, he was no longer in a classroom. He was in a realm of pure music, where every note was a tribute to his mother's guidance. His performance was raw and full of emotion, and as complex passages gave way to tender memories, the room seemed to vanish, leaving only the language of his heart. When the final note faded into silence, the overwhelming applause that followed and the tear-streaked faces of his peers spoke volume. In that instant, amidst thunderous acclaim and a newly awakened community, Trevor Hayes was not just a scholarship student. He was a young man who had finally found his voice. Even as Mrs. Winters' icy reign began to crumble under the weight of undeniable talent and heartfelt truth, Trevor's father smiled proudly, saying, "Your mother would be so proud," as he straightened his tie in his work clothes. In that moment, despite all the cruelty he had endured, Trevor felt a gentle warmth, even as his heart still ached from the years of mistreatment by Mrs. Winters. Suddenly, Principal Edwards entered with Mrs. Foster and, to Trevor's surprise, Mrs. Winters herself. Her pristine appearance was marred by disheveled hair and a diminished posture. With genuine remorse in her voice, she apologized, admitting that from the moment Trevor walked into her classroom, she had set impossible challenges to confirm her own bitter assumptions. She confessed that for 20 long years she had envied the brilliance of his late mother, Layla, and now saw in Trevor the talent she had never achieved. Though her apology did little to erase the wounds of past cruelty, it marked a turning point in the auditorium filled with representatives from music conservatories. As the night unfolded, Trevor took the stage with his mentor, Elijah Carter, and performed a moving piece called Mother's Hands. In that electric moment, the pain, the prejudice, and the obstacles melted away into the transformative power of music, a power that would now propel him into a future where talent was honored and every note celebrated.